All right, everyone. I think we can begin now. We've got a decent number of people who've joined us. Hello, my name is Saleem Bharat. I'm an LSA Collegiate Fellow in the Department of Romance Languages and Literatures at the University of Michigan. I'm also one of the coordinators of the Jewish Muslim Research Network. And we're here today with Bryan Cheyette, Yulia Egorova, and Jonathan Glasser to discuss the analytical utility and conceptual validity of the concept, or rather category, Jewish-Muslim relations. So before we begin, allow me to introduce two things: our speakers, first of all, and the rationale behind today's webinar. Let me just stop sharing my screen as well. All right. So, first of all, the rationale behind today's webinar. So, a lot of my research is focused on relations between Jews and Muslims, in particular in contemporary France. And the more my research has progressed, the more I begin to doubt whether such a category is useful in the first place. Jonathan Glasser takes a slightly different perspective on this, as I'm sure he'll tell us later on. People might be also interested in having a look at a series of blog posts on our website, which is sites.lsa.umich/GMRN under the tab GMRN Review. The three blog posts that relate very directly to this question of what exactly is Jewish-Muslim relations. So, in part, what I suggest in my own work is that, and I summarize this in one of those blog posts, that Jewish-Muslim relations tends to reify Jews as Jews and Muslims as Muslims, and interactions as happening between, rather than flesh and blood individuals who are Jewish and Muslim in all their diversity, as between a set of symbols that are reified as Jews and as Muslims, and these relations tend to be reified as inherently tense or violent, or always about to spill over into some form of conflict. In particular, they seem to be overdetermined by the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, no matter where in the world we are. So increasingly, I've been thinking about this particular vision of Jewish-Muslim relations as a dominant vision of interactions between Jews and Muslims, as part of a broader phenomena of Islamophobia, in particular in France, in which anti-Muslim racism is constructed in part through the implicit understanding of Islam as being inherently anti-LGBT, anti-women, anti-liberal in general, and in France in particular, as incompatible with laïcité, French secularism, and more broadly incompatible with this sort of nebulous phrase that you keep hearing in France, the values of the Republic. And this is something that we've been hearing increasingly in the past few weeks in France after the horrific murder of Samuel Paty. And among this is also the idea that that the French Republic has a duty to protect its Jewish citizens from Muslims. And the slippage between Islamist and Muslim, even as it seems, as these seems to be two very different categories, the slippage, unfortunately, takes place quite easily. And in particular, right now, we see it with the French president's discourse on Islamist separatism. And he's very careful to say, I'm not saying Islamic separatism. But in actual fact, some of the measures that the French government has advocated for in this particular moment as a way to show that they're strong against Islamism seems to suggest a blurring of lines between these two categories. In particular, I'm thinking of the Minister of the Interior calling for the dissolution of the CCIF, which is the collective against Islamophobia in France, under the rationale that it is a Islamist organization. Now, people who are familiar with this particular organization will know that it is anything but an Islamist organization. It is the only organization in France that measures anti-Muslim racism. So essentially, what the French government is suggesting is that that associations that can be related to Islam already risk the perception that they might be either Islamist or might be susceptible to becoming Islamist. And so it's within this broader context that I am skeptical of what it means when a variety of actors, politicians, and media professionals in particular talk about Jewish-Muslim relations in a very particular way, or even when well-meaning individuals engage in Jewish-Muslim dialogue, but somehow not from a position of equals, but rather from a position of diffusing radicalization or reducing prejudice among Muslims towards Jews. So if that's our starting place, then Jewish-Muslim relations really isn't about interactions between Jews and Muslims, but it is something that's already caught up in a particular political project. So that's my perspective from my research in France, but this is why we have with us Yulia Egorova, Bryan Cheyette, and Jonathan Glasser, who will help I think help us expand this question outside of France, within France, and to bring their particular disciplinary and transdisciplinary perspectives to the question. So let me introduce each of our speakers, and then we'll listen to what they have to say, and then you'll have a chance to ask questions and share your thoughts as well. So Bryan Cheyette is a professor in the Department of English at the University of Reading. His research focuses on post-colonial literature and theory, British Jewish literature, theories of race and modernity, and Holocaust testimony. He's the author of several books, including Diasporas of the Mind, Jewish/Post-Colonial Writing, and The Nightmare of History, published in 2013. He's also no stranger to Michigan because he held a visiting professorship in English and Judaic Studies in 1997. So welcome back. I'm not actually in Michigan, so welcome back figuratively, and also you're with us virtually. So that's not a very nice welcome back, I'm afraid, Bryan, but it'll have to do. And Yulia Egorova is a professor in the Department of Anthropology, and she's also the director of the Center for the Study of Jewish Culture, Society, and Politics, both at Durham University. Her research focuses on the anthropology of Jewish communities, particularly in the UK and South Asia, and also Jewish-Muslim relations, broadly speaking, and interfaith and inter-community dialogue as well. Her most recent book was published in 2018 and is titled Jews and Muslims in South Asia, Reflections on Difference, Religion, and Race. Finally, Jonathan Glasser is an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at the College of William and Mary. He is a historical anthropologist whose work focuses on modern North Africa with particular attention to Algeria and Morocco. His first book was published in 2016 and is titled The Lost Paradise, Andalusi Music in Urban North Africa. His current project looks at Muslim-Jewish interactions around music and poetry in Algeria and its diaspora in the early modern and modern periods. And if I'm remembering correctly, Jonathan has a PhD from Michigan, so what a coincidence. All right, so I'm gonna I think Bryan is gonna start, and then Yulia will follow, and finally Jonathan. So Bryan, please go ahead.
Thanks so much. I want to address especially the theories and context side of Muslim-Jewish relations. The relations side, I think, certainly at present, are extremely difficult, largely, as you said, Adi, quite rightly, because of the security agenda. And I think the security agenda in the UK, I think it's called PREVENT, where you're meant to identify radical Muslims all over the place. I think that makes actual relations between organized Jews and Jewish communities and organized Muslims and Muslim communities difficult. But what I think, if we move away from the immediate politics, what I want to argue is that there's a tremendous amount of historical resource that we can identify and conceptual resources that make Muslim-Jewish relations, or at least a category of Muslim-Jewish, I think something that's worthwhile. I think with all of these categories, we have to ask, why Muslim-Jewish and not Muslim-Irish or Muslim-Italian or Muslim-Chinese, or, why Muslim-Jewish? The same you could ask, say, in America, the category of Black Jewish is very prevalent, less prevalent in Europe. I'm not sure how prevalent the category of Muslim Jewish is in the United States, so that's something we could think about. But I certainly think in a European context, the category of Muslim Jewish is something that's real and worth talking about and has real historical bearings, and conceptually is something that Muslims especially draw upon. But I would argue that Jews also need to draw upon quite a number of books that I've got here, and I'll show you a few, conceptualizing Islamophobia, but also Islamophilia as well. And what I noticed when I first started looking into this area, that whereas anti-Semitism and theories of anti-Semitism are still really under the shadow of the Holocaust and are very teleological and have the horrors of genocide at the back of them, that means that there's no real understanding of anti-Semitism within a Western liberal context. Whereas I think quite a number of the studies of Islamophobia and Islamophilia and the good, bad Muslim do precisely locate these discourses within a Western liberal context. So I think there's a lot actually that Jews can learn from various theories. And I'll just point to a few, but the first one is interesting because there's very much a Michigan connection here. This is the book edited by Andrew Shryock, which was a Michigan conference, Islamophobia, Islamophilia. And it very much looks at both sides of the discourse. So in other words, it's not just reducing the discourse to one of hatred, hostility, fear, but it also looks at the question of desire, questions of integration, acculturation, conversion in a secular sense, not in a religious sense. There are other books that I think really reinforce this kind of approach. So, and this is in an American context. So Mahmoud Mamdi's Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, as well, which I think is both an academic book, but also for the general readership as well. It's very readable. And this book does draw on Jewish history in, I think, quite interesting ways, sometimes in ways that I would disagree with, but there's a lot of connections here between Muslim history and Jewish history. Now, to be a bit more specific, I would first of all emphasize the various historical links, and there's lots of different ways of thinking about this. So if we go back to Said talks about secret sharers. There's questions of analogies, looking at these histories in an analogical way, a contextual way, or a comparative way. So there's lots of different ways of theorizing these links. But if you look, for instance, at the Runnymede Trust, and it was the Runnymede Trust that popularized the term Islamophobia in the 1890s. And some people argue that the problem with that popularization, rather like the term anti-Semitism, is that it makes anti-Muslim racism exceptional. And it makes it difficult, therefore, to have a comparative context. But there is certainly in the Runnymede Trust work, and also in very contemporary work. So there was a parliamentary report in 2018, which essentially used the international definition of anti-Semitism as a way of thinking through how you could have a broader international agreed upon definition of Islamophobia. So Muslims draw on Jewish resources. Jews, I think, should draw more on the work on Islamophobia and the kinds of histories in these books. So, I mean, just to read a little bit from the Runnymede Trust, both Jews and Muslims are perceived by people hostile to them to be foreigners and intruders in European societies. There's a strong religious component in both kinds of hostility. So again, this is all just about hostility, the negative stereotypes. So it's about negative stereotypes, not positive stereotypes. Hostility, not desire. So it looks at questions of exclusion, marginalization, discrimination, and argues that there are links there between Jewish and Muslim history. Now, my view of this is to broaden it out. So when I look at different comparisons between Jewish history and history of Muslims in the UK, I would look back at a time when Jews were regarded as terrorists, revolutionaries, anarchists, who, in contrast to those who conform to conventional liberal values, which validate family, religion, and community. And the overdetermination of religion conforms to a culture which has historically divided minorities into public and private, confining religious identity to the home or to one's conscience. So in other words, there's a state intervention always in terms of controlling minorities, and especially minorities such as Jews historically, where there was mass immigration into Western Europe, UK, also America, where there were threats to the state coming from revolutionary Jews, left-wing Jews who rejected completely the liberal democratic values, or bourgeois liberal democratic values. There was all kinds of interventions constructing a community that could somehow control bad Jews, or help enable the integration, the acculturation, the assimilation of Jews into mainstream liberal culture. And I see a very similar process happening now. Hence the idea of good Muslims and bad Muslims. I see this very much as analogous. And I think that the history of I mean, the difference, of course, is that there's a generational difference, maybe 2 or 3 generations difference. but we have a choice. If you're someone like Matti Bunzl, you will write on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, Jews and Muslims, in an either-or way, and construct what I call a form of supersessionism. So in other words, Jews underwent the history of anti-Semitism. From Bunzl's point of view, it was within the nation state, and it was about the nation state excluding those who couldn't fit in. That eventually led to genocide. He then argues that Muslims, it's not about the nation state, it's about the pan-national state in a European context, and it's about Muslims not fitting in a European context. But it's very much supersessionist, it's either or. I would argue that if we think of history and the past not as something that's old, that's been superseded, but something that's very present to this day. It's not as if Jews are still not bifurcated as good and bad in all kinds of different political and cultural and social contexts, just as Muslims are. So I would argue that if we think of history as a resource for Jews and Muslims, and not simply as something that's past and that's old, then I think that is something that would be very helpful. Certainly those politically and also socially and culturally. So the way that Muslims organize, they've modeled their organization in the UK, and I think in France and elsewhere in Western Europe, on Anglo-Jewish organizations. So I think there's a great deal in which Muslims do look to Jews as a kind of model minority, and do try and model themselves on Jews and Jewish organization. So the Jewish Muslim Council of Britain is modeled on the Board of Deputies, the British Board of Deputies. Muslims themselves, I think in practice, do draw on Jews conceptually in relation to Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. It shouldn't be, and I don't believe it is, a one-way street. I think Jews should also draw on Muslim conceptualization of Islamophobia in the ways that I've suggested. And there is a resistance, obviously, to this. I've mentioned Matti Bunzl, but let me just, there's another book here, and I'll finish on this point in terms of resistance to these analogies. This is a book by Saeed and Vakil, Thinking Through Islamophobia, Global Perspectives. And here there's a kind of extraordinary statement just to show that how far we still have to go. So similarly, in contrast to the clear assertion of the unprovoked nature of anti-Semitism, some Muslims are accused of contributing to Islamophobia. The Muslim community is internally differentiated between good and bad Muslims. So this is now an established way of thinking, and the activities of bad Muslims are seen as contributing to Islamophobia. This is the key point that I want to stress. No similar split is present in the case of the Jewish communities. There are neither moderate Zionists nor extreme Zionists, let alone good Jews and bad Jews. The distinction between bad Muslims and good Muslims is played out as a distinction between Muslims and fundamentalists. Now, you can see that there are approaches to conceptualizing Islamophobia and Islamophilia, which want to make the Muslim case exceptional. My takeaway point is that neither the Jewish case nor the Muslim case should be seen as exceptional. What they are is historical and part of general history and general politics. There are obviously all kinds of differences, but there are a great deal of similarities to be had. And there is this tendency in some studies of Islamophobia to just say this is about Muslims and no one else and no other group. And the idea that there's no such thing as good Jews and bad Jews, when of course the ultimate good Jew is the Jew who converts to Christianity, is something that I find extraordinary. So maybe I'll end on that point, that, and I hope that's helpful to kick off the discussion.
Thank you for that. I think that was actually really helpful, and it leads us very nicely to Yulia's work, because I remember reading her book and thinking that her arguments about how contemporary Islamophobia draws on older models of anti-Semitism especially in South Asia, which is a place where you would think that that European anti-Semitism wouldn't have resonance. But anyway, I'll leave Yulia to explain that herself.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed, Adi, and of course, thank you for inviting me to the panel. I'm really happy to be here and take part in this discussion. You mentioned my work on Jews and Muslims in South Asia, and indeed, for me, that was the starting point for engaging with this topic. Some of the material that I draw on there goes back more than 15 years, back to the days when I was working with mainly the Jewish communities in India, where I could immediately notice that they would oftentimes live side by side with Muslim communities, for instance, in Mumbai. And eventually, after a few years, I got an opportunity to explore these problematics in a book-length study. So in a sense, that project started very much as a study of what I, at the time, would probably conceptualize more indeed as Jewish-Muslim relations. But firstly, very quickly, it became clear to me that Jewish-Muslim relations indeed need to be considered against the backdrop of the wider history of minority experiences in South Asia, and of course against the wider backdrop of colonial and post-colonial experiences in South Asia. And in this respect, focusing specifically on the experiences of Jewish and Muslim communities, as well as on different discourses and narratives pertaining to the imageries of Jews and Muslims, I was very much influenced by Bryan Cheyette's work. Indeed, in examining those interlinked histories of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And as far as the concept of Jewish-Muslim relations is concerned, in the book, in the end, I ended up arguing that it could be theorized, amongst other things, as a trope that was a product of the same European discourses and processes of marginalization and minoritization that have historically produced Jews and Muslims as the other, both in Europe and in South Asia. So I would say that in the book, I argue that indeed one could probably use Jewish-Muslim relations as a very broad umbrella term for a very wide range of interactions and encounters between Jewish and Muslim groups, communities, individuals, just Jewish and Muslim spaces. But it could also be theorized more as a trope. As some of you might know, in the past 6 years, I think I've been working with, oh, thank you, Brian, that's very kind. Here it is, very generous of you. In the past 6 or 7 years, I've also been working with an initiative in Jewish-Muslim dialogue already here in the UK, and it has been a real privilege for me working with this group. I've also had an opportunity to, well, I wouldn't say interview, or talk at length with different interlocutors involved in initiatives in Jewish-Muslim dialogue. And when I started working with them, it of course became to me immediately obvious that, for instance, here in the UK, Jewish-Muslim relations is a very widespread category of practice. So there is a plethora of initiatives in Jewish-Muslim dialogue, Muslim-Jewish dialogue, that would have Muslim-Jewish in the title. So these are initiatives that are explicitly thematized as initiatives in Muslim-Jewish dialogue. And what also became to me very clear straight away is that my interlocutors certainly do theorize Muslim-Jewish relations as a category of analysis. So they would certainly see this category as very valid and useful analytically. And in this sense, I can only refer to anthropologist Michael Herzfeld, who has argued, I think, very insightfully that our interlocutors in the field, like if we're talking about anthropologists, but I think of course it would be true for other social theorists, can theorize and can do theory just as well as we do in anthropology or in social studies. So of course it is hard not to pay attention to the way my interlocutors thematize Muslim-Jewish relations. Also, what became quite obvious to me very soon is that different initiatives or different participants in one and the same initiative would certainly theorize Muslim-Jewish relations in a variety of ways, just like they would theorize Jewish and Muslim identities in a variety of ways. And to go back to the point that Aldi made in the introduction, one of the dangers of sort of over-stabilizing, over-theorizing Muslim-Jewish relations as a conceptual category is that one can end up really kind of sedimenting both Jewish-Muslim relations and Jewish and Muslim identities around the very, very set set of imageries. So of course there is this danger, and I've certainly seen this tension, say when both academic and non-academic commentators would sometimes point out that on the one hand, initiatives in Muslim-Jewish dialogue really try to emphasize those shared Muslim and Jewish identities, but at the same time, on the other hand, they certainly fix them and essentialize them in ways that can be helpful, analytically limiting, or sometimes even dangerous. And what I'm working on at the moment is engaging with this particular interesting theoretical tension. And I would suggest that, again, we probably need to widen our conceptual apparatus and to go beyond just theorizing the way our interlocutors view identity and difference in the field, just as essentialists and constructivists. And in this respect, I was very much inspired by Paula Haywood's recent theory suggesting that people just do difference differently. And there are different styles of theorizing identities and differences out there. So it's not all about being either essentialist or constructivist in your understandings of identity. And of course, yeah, I don't have time to offer any ethnographic examples, but I could oftentimes see the way my research participants would, on the one hand, clearly envision Judaism and Islam as two very separate religions. They would certainly only identify as either Jewish or Muslim. They would know who is Jewish and who is Muslim in their groups. But at the same time, at a certain register of comparison, they would sometimes thematize the nature of Jewishness and Muslimness, or the nature of Judaism and Islam, and or they would thematize the experiences of Jews and Muslims in the UK as shared to the extent that all but eliminates any significant difference between the two, and sometimes they would oscillate between these two poles within one meeting or within one conversation. So in this respect, I also was very much taken by the way Jonathan Glasser suggested, I think, very elegantly and insightfully in the blog post that Adi mentioned, that it might be hard to hear the plural in relations when it comes to Muslim-Jewish relations, but it is definitely there. And so to answer the question about what contribution I think I could make to the debate about the analytical validity of Jewish-Muslim relations, I would say that what I'm trying to do now in my ethnographic work is to focus on that plural in the way my interlocutors theorize Muslim-Jewish relations. So I think I should probably stop here.
Thank you so much, Yulia, and thanks for ending with that that glance towards Jonathan. Jonathan, if you'll take us away now.
All right, thank you so much. It's great to be here with Bryan and Yulia and Adi. Thanks so much for having me. It's nice to kind of virtually be in Michigan again, right? So I'm going to, Yulia very generously mentioned of this blog post, and I'm going to, for anyone who's read it already, forgive me for staying fairly close to it. This is very much a kind of, I don't know if it's a new train of thought, but something I've been working on kind of in writing more recently. And what I'm going to do, right, and as Adi mentioned earlier, is I'm going to make a very kind of, I'd say, tentative case for Muslim-Jewish relations as a conceptual category. And just to give you a little bit of background, my own work, current work, that's focusing a book project about Muslim-Jewish relationships around music and poetry in Algeria, and then a smaller project that's actually on Judeo-Arabic and kind of debates about Judeo-Arabic. They come out of the earlier work that I've done that was very much about Muslims and Jews, but where I purposefully eschewed the category of Muslim-Jewish relations. And after publishing that as a book and kind of feeling like I finished that project, I had this moment of, I would say, perhaps regret, right? Or self-critique, where I said to myself, what was I avoiding? Right? I was talking lots and lots about Jews and about Muslims and about relationships between Jews and Muslims, but I made a very, very pointed effort to avoid talking about that directly. And I mean, I think there's some good reasons. I'm very much following, I think, a trend of trying to think about Jews as embedded within various contexts, in this case, in the Maghrebi context, but that somehow left me feeling very dissatisfied. And that is what really pushed me to start thinking more directly about some of those materials, explicitly in terms of the Jewish-Muslim question. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to rehearse this argument that I've laid out in the blog post. And I'm just going to kind of walk through it very, very briefly, and in some ways kind of narrate my own thinking about this. And so keep in mind, please, that this is coming out of a kind of long period of research and analysis where I feel like I myself have gone through a lot of transformations and questions, and these questions are still very much alive. So the basic point I want to start off with is that I totally get the critique of the Muslim-Jewish relations category, right? So I have long felt that it brings to mind this image of basically two binaries, right? A binary that splits into two solid kind of blocks, and it's deeply redefined. And it reminds me very much of the way we talk about states, right? Like Soviet-US relations, right? That's the sort of thing that comes to mind. And that strikes me as incredibly reductionist and incredibly not useful, right? For talking about the sorts of things I've been interested in. So, so that's one part of it that I feel very sympathetic to. And the corollary to this sort of binary kind of blockification, right, is this attempt, I think, to very summarily judge the nature of those relations. So this is less about good Jews versus bad Jews or good Muslims versus bad Muslims. It's more about good Muslim-Jewish relations versus bad Muslim-Jewish relations. So there's this tendency to say, like, things were good in the past, right? Or this is a exemplary association, right? That is doing good Muslim-Jewish relations. And this is something that I'm sure comes up a lot in the UK. I'm more familiar with it from France, right? And of course, Adi, like I know we've talked about this question about how that fits into non-Jewish, non-Muslims politics in France is very, very, very kind of complicated and not so pretty. So this image that Adi, you brought my attention to from Yulia, your work of the wedding in the synagogue, right, which can be seen by an outsider as, oh my God, this is great. This is like the good Muslim-Jewish relations, right? Can then be reread from inside as well. It's just practical, right? Like there's nothing. This is not really about Muslim-Jewish relations. It's about what's available, right, and what in the neighborhood we live in. And so, for me, that's a very, very important kind of step to do. But here are my kinds of these are my misgivings, and I'm going to kind of walk through them in three steps. So the three are going to be about the question of going beyond individuals, and the question of kind of groups and categories. The second is this question of closeness, and the third is the question of the universal human subject. And I'm going to be very brief. I think the first one is the most the one I'm going to talk about the most, however. So my first concern is that when we try to move away from the concept of Muslim-Jewish relations, I think that we might be giving away some things that we need to keep in our toolbox. And so one of these is the ability to talk about people not just as individuals, right? We do want to be able to talk about them as individuals, but we want to be able to talk about them also in relation to symbolic systems, right? Without reducing them to symbols. And in relation to what we often talk about as kind of social structures and political institutions that go beyond, but also encompass the individual. Hopefully not totally, and I'm very aware of the kind of totalizing weight that can be brought to these. But the point here that I want to underline is that Muslims and Jews, yes, they are individuals who happen to be Muslim or Jewish, but they're also members of all sorts of structures and organizations, right? And so the question of organized Muslims and organized Jews, Brian, that you were bringing up, is an important piece of this, right? And they are, of course, also subjects of various kinds of law, whether those are secular or religious law, many of which make a very, very, very big deal about people's categories of being Muslim or Jewish. So within these kind of overlapping layers of institutions and legal arrangements, et cetera, individual Muslims and Jews can come into relationship. And some of these forms of relationship emphasize difference, right? While others might minimize or efface it. And that's really fascinating, Yulia. I would love to hear more about kind of what you're talking about that happening in the same moment. And that's the part of it where the plural of relations becomes very important. It's both the plural of relations being perhaps kind of simultaneous and moving in different directions or emphasizing different ends, right, depending on the situation. But it can also be that there are many, many, many relationships, right? And that there's also relationships that are internal to the two sides, right? So Muslim-Jewish relations is also about Jews' relations with one another and Muslims' relations with one another, right? Kind of with that third kind of in mind. So the one caveat I'm going to put out here is that I'm also very wary of a kind of historicizing version of this sort of argument that I think just kind of puts the problem of the good and the bad into time rather in terms of geography, right? Which is to say, I'm very wary also of this tendency to say, oh, things were really great in the past, right? And then, whatever happened, right? Israel was created, or the French invaded Algeria, or whatever, right? There's this very powerful, I think, tendency to kind of move toward that And of course, we have to be paying attention to those changes and those powers and everything else. But I'm also, want to keep in mind that in some ways replicates some of the things I'm concerned about. So that's the first kind of issue that I'm trying to bring up here. The second one I'm going to touch on this much more briefly is a concern about the idea of closeness. So my sense of it is that when people talk about Muslim-Jewish relations, that they can fall into a sense of a kind of stereotyped form of relationship that then undercuts some more real intertwinings that are much richer. And that is, I think, one of the reasons in my first project, I really ran away from the Muslim-Jewish thing, right? Because in fact, what I was trying to do was I was trying to get at some kind of intimacy that really is not captured in the language of relations. The problem with this, however, is that I think there is a trap by which we can wind up, in fact, not paying attention to Jews, in the case of the Maghreb, right, where groups can be so embedded as to be buried, right, where we cannot, in fact, even see what's happening anymore. And this is the part of it that I think that there's some very rich aspects, particularly in anthropological literature, about closeness that we really still have to work through. And so what does it mean to be close, right? Doesn't social closeness imply difference already? A difference that here is in fact entangled with intimacy, right? We can't be intimate with ourselves, right? We need some other, right? So the everyday notion of relations might not capture just how close we're talking about, but this raises the question of, well, how close can you get, right? And this is the part that I mentioned in my blog post. There's this great Groucho Marx line, which he says, says, "If I hold you any closer, I'll be in back of you," right? And so this is a line that has been brought to my attention in recent years and has really stuck with me. Finally, the third concern I'm going to end with here is that when we avoid the framework of Muslim-Jewish relations, I think it becomes too easy to differentiate between that aspect of a person that is Muslim or Jewish and that which is an ostensibly universal human subject, right? And this comes up, I think, in insider discourse a lot, right? Oh, I don't think about this person as a Muslim or a Jew. I just think of them as whatever, right? Which, in the US really rings lots of alarm bells about race, right? Which is a very, very common trope in the US. I'm sure other places too. And so the problem that happens here that I think is really interesting is I feel like this is actually replicating a whole bunch of other tropes and processes that are very much about sequestering Jewishness and Muslimness in a particular thing, whether that's the thing one does at home or the thing that you do in the mosque or the synagogue, right? And this is, I think, a tendency that lots of Muslims and Jews do themselves, right, in terms of kind of insider discourse. And I think it's quite problematic. So in other words, when we think about Jewish and Muslim in terms of a critique of Muslim-Jewish relations, I fear that we are in fact using the narrowest and most parochial notion of Muslimness and Jewishness available and kind of replicating that. So those are kind of my three kind of issues that I'm bringing up. I think that in practice, I avoid the term Jewish-Muslim relations like the plague, like when writing. But I think it's really interesting to think through this kind of out loud and together. So I'm very much aware of this kind of stultifying power of that trope. But my big fear is that we'll liberate ourselves from that yoke. And then all of a sudden we'll be facing some actual Muslim-Jewish relations and we won't know what to do, right? So I'm going to kind of leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I think we've got lots of different paths to explore right now together. So I just want to remind people who are watching that you can ask questions or make comments through the Q&A function. You should see it on the lower bar, Q&A. If you click on that, you can type in your questions if you feel more sort of comfortable expressing yourself in writing, like me. If you're more eloquent orally, then you can write in the chat and just sort of maybe just put something like stack so that I know the order, and then I'll unmute you, and then you can ask your question orally. But for the next few minutes, we're going to have a discussion about what was just presented with Yulia, Bryan, and Jonathan. And I think to get us started, I just want to ask Bryan to expand on something. So you mentioned, Bryan, a term, supersessionist thinking, and you've written an article about this, I think, a couple of years ago in relation to Jewish studies and post-colonial studies. And here you were using it in terms of Jewish-Muslim relations. I just wondered if you could expand on that a little bit. Tell us, first of all, what is supersessionist thinking, and why should we, as well, for those of us who work in Jewish studies or post-colonial studies or both, why should we be concerned with supersessionist thinking, and how does this relate to the category of Jewish-Muslim relations?
Okay, well, thanks so much, Adi, for putting me on my hobby horse. So I'm grateful for that. But I think it does apply to Jewish-Muslim relations, or to the term in inverted commas. First of all, I think what Jews and Muslims politically, religiously should have in common is a rejection of the term Judeo-Christian. So Judeo-Christian is used by the political right essentially to marginalize, disenfranchise, exclude Muslims, and to bring Jews into a dominant political culture. A right-wing culture, a kind of pro-Iraq invasion culture, and that term has been used politically and strategically, and Jews don't reject it enough. Those that know do. But it's a term. It's a very strange term, and this will bring me on to the supersessionism. But it was used both by Reagan and Thatcher as a way of creating an alternative radical right and bring Jews into the picture as a model minority. It was also at the same time used by post-colonial theorists. So this is in the late 1970s, 1980s. Judeo-Christian was used by post-colonial theorists as a way of thinking of European culture as white Judeo-Christian, and a way of excluding, whether purposefully or not, but the result was an exclusion of the history of anti-Semitism, the history of Jewish marginalization, from the European terrain. And it was also a way of just thinking of Europe as white, which in and of itself, as Paul Gilroy has shown, is very dubious. Okay, so Judeo-Christian is a problem. And the main reason it's a problem is that within Judaism and Christianity, if you look at the Christian version of theology, it divides it up into the Old Testament and the New Testament. So in other words, the Hebrew Bible and the Greek Bible become Old and New. And supersessionism, in a nutshell, is thinking, using the binary Old and New, and using it reductively and in a totalizing way. So the category, for instance, new Jews is quite common. It's also very common in thinking of anti-Muslim racism. So Muslims themselves could be designated, have been designated as new Jews. My problem with that is twofold, I think. One, it's very reductive and it kind of empties Muslims out of any kind of cultural, social, identitarian content in making them new Jews. It's also a way of completely placing Jews in the past and nowhere else. So Jews as minority, Jews as the objects of racism are very much placed in the past. And it's a way of trying, if you like, to appropriate what is seen and rightly seen as a kind of dominant discourse. So discourses around the Holocaust, around anti-Semitism. This is a discourse that the West uses politically, strategically, and against Muslim interest. You could argue that. But as I say, the problem with supersessionism, it turns any kind of thinking about history in an interconnected way into a zero-sum game where only one history counts, the other history is placed in the past. So because my main project is to interconnect various histories, as Yulia kindly said in my book, Diasporas of the Mind, and also my latest book on the ghetto, what supersessionism does is disconnect. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes absolute sense to me. Yulia and Jonathan, do you want to add something to that or take us in a different direction?
Yeah, if I could just interject briefly, I would say that, yes, I mean, this problematic and this line of analysis, I think, is very fruitful, and we can get much less analytical mileage from conceptualizing Muslims as new Jews. So I agree with Bryan that it certainly ignores the whole complexity of Jewish and Muslim experiences, both in the past and in the present. I completely agree with him when he says that it both empties Muslims of any cultural, historical, and identitarian context, but at the same time, it ignores the more recent and contemporary experiences of Jewish communities.
Yeah, thank you.
I find that it's really helpful to kind of hear you talk through this, Bryan. Oh, you can't hear me.
No, it's there's ringing. I don't know why.
Ah, okay. But you know, I think that's incredibly interesting and helpful to hear you talk through this. And I mean, I think the other, you know, just one other thing I'm going to kind of just throw in here, just to kind of like roil it up a little bit, is that, you know, I think that the kind of reduction and kind of draining that you're talking about here of any kind of actual content, I also think that can play out for when we start to get into Muslim-Jewish relations sort of thing. For a lot of Jews of North African descent, say in France, when talking about the kind of deep past, and this does get into some of the polemics, most of which I'm super suspicious of around, you know, dhimmi status, right, which is incredibly politicized kind of for the right in France. But I do think that it's like because the Muslim-Jewish thing is so much about connection and kind of symmetry that I think it can also miss some real examples, which are very important to think through in kind of dispassionately, I think, of much more hierarchical relationships in certain moments, right? And so that's another piece of this that I personally kind of struggle with speaking with people, particularly Jews in France, about this, right? Because it's that's another kind of content that actually doesn't fit in very comfortably when we talk about Muslim-Jewish relations in the way that I think it often gets talked about today. I'm just going to kind of throw that out there.
No, interesting. So when you say hierarchical, could you give some examples of that hierarchical relation? Because I'm sure you're right.
Yeah, I mean, in the French colonial context, of course, there's the deeply hierarchical kind of structure that Jews get kind of absorbed into. But one of the things that's so striking about that is that it's a kind of reversal of certain kinds of hierarchies that were built into kind of the deeper kind of political and religious system in the Maghreb, in many, many places. And so I'm very much, I'm not one to say that, at least should think about kind of dhimmi status of Jews as kind of protected minority under Muslim rule as something that's always kind of, awful and whatever, right? There's some very, very simplifying ways that people have talked about this.
Absolutely.
But that's certainly a kind of, there's a deep history in many, many places of those sorts of hierarchical relations. And I think we can learn a lot from thinking about those in a, in a complex way, right? That is going to be part of the picture of Muslim-Jewish relations if we start to think about that in a kind of multi-historical way. And so that's, that was the example that was coming to mind for me. And so, one of the challenges is that we actually do have to grapple with that when we start to talk about Muslim-Jewish relations in the sense of kind of community dialogue, right? And so that's one of the things that I think that we need to be prepared for, in a sense. Mm-hmm.
I wonder if one way to get at this issue is actually through the methodology that Yulia uses in her book Jews and Muslims in South Asia, where she disavows a sort of Goethean thick description and opts for something called thin description, something that she calls doing anthropology out of the corner of one's eye. So I wonder if Yulia, you could tell us a little bit more about that methodological approach that you took, and how it might help us tackle this larger conceptual issue.
Yeah, thank you, Adi. The concept of a thin description was developed by John Jackson. I'm afraid I haven't got his book now in my office because during the lockdown I took it home. Otherwise, I normally keep it right here on my desk. John Jackson, on the level of ethnography, actually worked with communities of Jewish descent, who are sometimes described as emerging Jewish communities. So this is a problematic that I looked at in my previous projects, where I worked with formerly Dalits on untouchable communities in South Asia who embraced a Jewish descent. And John Jackson explores the problematic of thin description in the context of his work conducted amongst African-American communities, also embracing Jewish and Israelite descent. What I really liked about his engagement with Geertsen notion of thick description, about his critique of Geertsen notion of thick description, is this observation that we just have to try and work on as many registers as we can, engaging with our research participants, realizing that we will never have that fully complex picture. All that we can do is just to slice into the phenomena that we're trying to explore from very different angles and approach it from different directions. You mentioned kindly that in my book I describe my research as doing anthropology out of the corner of one's eye, And what I meant by this is indeed that observing Jewish-Muslim relations is very different from, say, trying to observe like, weddings or trying to observe pilgrimage. So it's not that one tangible thing that is right in front of you where you can just go and conduct a very bounded anthropological study. So it's all about studying those fleeting, serendipitous moments that not all of your research participants, not all of your academic or non-academic interlocutors would even thematize as Jewish-Muslim relations. So I thought that John Jackson's concept of thin description was very useful to think with. When I first came across it, I thought, well, that's exactly what I'm trying to do. Like, I would never claim that what I'm trying to explore is indeed thick description, or that I somehow know better or can provide a much fuller picture. So it's always a picture for it's one particular slice. It's me approaching the topic from one particular direction. So I hope that it's managed to contribute something to the debate rather than take all analytical mileage away from it. If I could make maybe a very brief comment just to comment on Bryan's observation of supersessionism in answer to your question. Bryan noted in his presentation again, the interlinked histories of the development of their Runnymede report and their International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. And I thought that this is another extremely interesting side, which demonstrates that, yes, indeed, the histories are interlinked. And on the one hand, it's very tempting to say that, yes, this is a move in the wrong direction, and the development of these definitions only essentializes Jewish and Muslim identities. But then, as Bryan suggested, there is a lot of dialogue going on here. There are all kinds of conceptual bridges. There are all kinds of sort of practical bridges being built. So I would say that maybe bringing it back to my theoretical observation about the difficulty of kind of pigeonholing our research participants' modes of thinking and describing them purely as essentialist or constructivist. I would say this is another excellent example where I would hesitate to say that, yes, trying to develop specifically a definition of Islamophobia or of anti-Semitism or any other forms of racism is just purely particularist project. So I think that it could also be thematized in much more universalist terms.
Yes, no, absolutely. I think anti-racism is indivisible. And I think the category of Muslim Jewish could certainly be used as a resource to show that, that there's so much overlap historically and politically and conceptually. The whole history of Orientalism, for instance, brings Jews and Muslims together in all kinds of ways, as Saeed showed, and many others have showed. And as soon as you look at the Ottoman Empire and North Africa, then you can find all kinds of historical resources there for interconnected histories. So that is happening in practice. And whilst there might be all kinds of issues about the particular definitions on both sides, I think it's something that we can build on and something that is a useful practice to have, rather than just disciplining each of our particular areas, putting each of us in a particular silo. So absolutely.
I am muted, sorry. I'm just going to invite Dalia Candioti, who had a hand raised. I think she has got a comment or a question to make. Let's see if this works. Hi, Dalia.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
Oh, great. Okay. Thank you so much. This has been very thought-provoking. I'm really interested in, I have tons of questions, but I guess I have a particular question for Jonathan and Yulia, because I agree with the critique of Jewish-Muslim relations, and which posits the communities and their cultures in terms of two separate entities that then external forces sort of bring together: organizations, academics, activists, etc. And not that that can't happen or there's something wrong with that per se, but sometimes this idea can really exclude the intimacies that, sort of to use Jonathan's word, and obviously the overlaps. And you just mentioned overlaps, Bryan, but I think that in general, the dominant idea in Jewish-Muslim relations is to bring together two separate and different entities, where we know from Judeo-Muslim culture, and we're going to put aside Judeo-Christian, but I think there's not enough emphasis on Judeo-Muslim culture, and Ella Shohat has been making this point for decades now, and trying to bring to the fore this idea. So that's why I'd like to know more about, Jonathan, your work and your work on Judeo-Arabic, for example, because when we look at not only individuals, because you talked a lot about individuals and organizations, but also cultural formations, symbolic systems, and etc., you see that the categories are not separable, right? So maybe if you could say something about, what your work is like on Judeo-Arabic. Right. And Yulia, I will read your book. I'm sorry I haven't gotten to it yet, but where how you handle the idea of sort of the inseparability of cultural formations, and also of people's own idea of where they fit in the larger world in terms of having Jewish and Muslim cultures. Thank you. Sorry for going on a bit too long.
No, thank you for that, Dalia.
Dalia, I want to just address your question just very briefly. I could kind of go on and on about the Judeo-Arabic side of things, and I have to say that first of all, the kind of the category of Judeo-Arabic, as you probably know, Ella Shohat has very severely critiqued that category. I actually feel that I have a very similar critique of the critique, in the sense that I think it's an important critique to make, which is to say that the idea of Judeo-Arabic creates, first of all, a false connection between various Jewish ways of speaking Arabic in different parts of the Arabic-speaking world, right? And also minimizes the existence of variety within Arabic, period, outside the Jewish speakers, right? So that side of the critique is very, very important, right? And she's also, in some ways, it's very much parallel to this question of the Judeo-Muslim thing, right? The Jewish-Muslim thing. And she has this great, phrase where she says, this hyphen is in fact all about separation, right? And that's, I think, a very, very valuable point. But the problem for me then becomes, what are the assumptions that are sneaking in here? A, about what is Arabic, right? And B, what is Jewish, right? And so I think what can start happening is that I get the sense from Ella Shohat's pieces that are critiquing this category of Judeo-Arabic, is it's a very similar sort of sequestering of Jewishness within a really kind of post-Enlightenment idea from Europe of what constitutes religion, right? And so that's the part I get very nervous about, because I think that it starts to make, I think that we're sneaking in a whole bunch of what, I could say is a kind of really a sort of nation state model that is being sneaked in under the cover of the critique of the nation state. And so that's a strong misgiving that I have. But that being said, actually, I find that her critique, both the way I summarized it before and her actual discussions of particularly musical interactions in Iraq, fantastic, right? Because once you actually do start looking kind of on the ground in a much more direct way, you do start to see all sorts of commonality and difference that are absolutely connected to one another and absolutely dependent on one another. So I think at one point in her critique of Judeo-Arabic, she talks about differentiated commonalities, which I think is what we should be aiming for being able to see. But the big question is, how do you get there? And actually, that's the part of the Judeo-Arabic critique that I'm worried that we are actually cutting off the path that we need to make in order to get there. Yeah. Does that make, Dalia, does that ring any bells, either of harmony or of alarm?
I thank you. No, I actually wondered about your own take on Judeo-Arabic, starting from your own critique of Judaism.
Right.
And so
yeah.
on. So, so how do you work with it?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a kind of basic way that I try to, kind of the pragmatic aspect of it is whenever I talk about Judeo-Arabic, I'm only talking about written texts that use Hebrew script, right? To write Arabic, right? So I'm fine with using Judeo-Arabic as a term to kind of do that, and so that's the way I try to use it when I'm writing. But on the other hand, when we start actually looking at texts, Judeo-Arabic texts, we can find a huge range of relationships to a kind of more standard Arabic, right? Much richer than the kind of stereotypical view of Judeo-Arabic, which is as well, it's kind of this kind of bastardized version, right? That's kind of colloquial. And so when we start looking at early modern texts, for example, we can find all sorts of instances where it's absolutely clear that the person who's writing the Judeo-Arabic text is absolutely literate in Arabic, right? And so that's really, those are really fascinating moments where you can start to pick that out. But just one last thing I'll just say about this is that I think it's also important to differentiate between Judeo-Arabic as a kind of term of art to talk about written texts, particularly about language, versus Judeo-Arabic as a way to talk about things like speech and music and performance and those other sorts of things. And those actually open up some really, really rich possibilities that I'm trying to explore more in my current work.
We're going to move on to, we've got a few questions in the Q&A box. So I'm just going to read the first one. And just a reminder to everyone else, if you do have a question, you can use the raise hand function if you want to ask it orally, put it in the chat, or write it in the Q&A. So this is from Karen Skenazi, and I'm going to read it out. I've been thinking about what Bryan was saying about good Muslims, bad Muslims, good Jews, bad Jews. If I'm understanding correctly, we should see an analogy here. But does this analogy bear out? You note that there were threats to the state by left Jews, bad Jews in inverted commas, but were most of these threats in the name of Judaism? How many Meir Kahans were there? Was someone like Emma Goldman, for instance, a threat to the state as a Jew, or did she just happen to be a Jew who fought the state?
That's a great question. I would say that they were racialized as Jews. So the analogy that I'm making is between the Russian Revolution, the number of Jews in a leadership role. Certainly this was seen not just by avowed anti-Semites, but it was in all of the right-wing press. the right-wing press also republished the protocols of the Elders of Zion, so you had a kind of conspiratorial view of Jews. It was also a global event as well, so it placed the Jewish threat and looked at the Jewish threat globally, and there's no question that from a certain perspective, someone like Emma Goldman was certainly racialized as a Jew, as was Marx and Trotsky and a lot of the other leadership. And this wasn't particularly unusual at the time. I'm talking about pre-war, obviously. This form of racialization was part of the air that everyone breathed in Europe and the US. So I'm not looking at the Meir Kahanas who were terrorists in the name of Judaism, but I think it's the Russian Revolution, the revolutionary threat, and there was all kinds of bombings by anarchists in UK, in major cities. So there are quite a few analogies there, I would say.
And I can't help but think about, not to be too presentist, but I can't help but think about what's happening right now in France and the French government's attack on things like, what they call intersectionality or critical race theory and decolonial studies. No one's actually sure that they really know what they're talking about when they mention these things, but implicitly actually quite explicitly what they're doing is that they, right after these attacks, they're linking decolonial academics, decolonial thinkers, and intersectional feminists with terrorism. And Pascal Bruckner on a TV platform, he accused Rokhaya Diallo, this was maybe a week or so ago, of essentially laying the ground for these acts of terrorism. So Rokhaya Diallo is a anti-racist activist and writer in France. So there's something very sort of I just can't help but think about what you were saying there in relation to this kind of witch hunt against racialized individuals under the guise of anti-terrorism.
No, it's that's really troubling to hear, because that's a kind of Trumpian type politics, and but surely France must, like the rest of Western Europe, divide its Muslims up. So if you're a Muslim who's integrated, who speaks French, goes to the French schooling system, ideally has some kind of professional job, they would be a model French citizen. Surely, I mean, I presume there is a similar division that I've been talking about in the UK between good and bad Muslims. That's right, yeah. Yeah, but yes, it's very interesting that the question of decolonizing the curriculum and is barely off the ground in the UK. It's amazing. It's amazing that it's already being politicized in France. I find that deeply depressing, deeply depressing.
And just to add on to that, I think what we see in both the UK and in France, and to some extent the United States, when it comes to who is a good Muslim, who is a bad Muslim, is in the moment where you are constantly asked to disaffiliate from terrorism. So implicitly, you're always already under suspicion. There's a edited book that's just been published, or is just about to be published by Manchester University Press, that's called "I Refuse to Condemn," and gathers a series of Muslim writers and thinkers around, particularly around this theme, and sort of actually the imperative not to be a good Muslim, not to fall into this position where you legitimize the creation of good and bad Muslims by constantly feeling the responsibility to condemn and perform an acceptable version of religion.
Interesting.
I have to just toss out something that's like a little bit kind of at cross purposes though. I mean, I personally was never really into Mahmoud Mamdani's argument about the good Muslim, bad Muslim thing. And I feel like it's a little bit of, it feels a little bit like a distraction from some other processes that are at work here. And I mean, so how can I get at this? I mean, when I look at the French situation, I'm extremely disturbed by what I'm seeing. But what I'm really seeing much more than the good Muslim, bad Muslim binary is something where the definition of Muslim is narrowing and narrowing and narrowing so as to exclude, first of all, actual Islamists, including non-violent Islamists. And I particularly find disturbing the term Salafist, right? Which is, of course, an incredibly diverse movement when we think about it. But in the French context, actually equals terrorist. I mean, it's a very disturbing trend. And I'm actually not so convinced that the good Muslim, bad Muslim separation or idea is actually helpful in clarifying that. And so I'm just throwing out, this is a doubt that I've nursed for a long time. And I particularly noticed it in teaching, right? When I've taught this argument, it doesn't quite hold up. And it winds up, I feel, actually missing the richness and content of actual Muslim practice, particularly in politics. So I personally feel like there's something else going on here that we're actually in some ways being distracted from.
Yulia, do you want to speak?
I just noticed another question by Matt Shaheen Richardson. Adi, shall we take? Matt, would you like me to speak to that, or
yeah, no, please.
Shall I read it out, because I guess, I guess, not everybody can see it, right?
No.
So Matt is asking, does the use of the term relations not itself draw attention to the way in which processes of minoritization and racialization, for example, are situated in continually mutating relations between peoples and their own social worlds? I wonder if the more problematic aspects of the category Muslim-Jewish relations stem from using of the terms relations as a merely descriptive marker and not an analysis of a processual relations of power. Yes, I think this is a great question, which again brings us back to the relations in Muslim-Jewish relations. I was just saying that it's very clear that it's a very, very important category of practice that certainly means a lot to different people. Like I sometimes when my friends and relatives who are not academics are asking me, so what is your current project about? I sometimes say as a shortcut, like Muslim-Jewish relations. And everybody always has an opinion. So everybody always has a mental image about what they're supposed to look like. And I think Matt is absolutely right when he says that we're dealing with a particular label, like a particular descriptive marker. And I would say that, yes, it is in this sense, this marker is very much a trope. So this mental image that this marker connects to can certainly be seen as a trope. But otherwise, yes, I would say one productive theoretical avenue in which one could take the discussion of our question today is theorizing relations more and paying more attention to the dimension of power.
Yeah, so I like that a lot, both what you said and Matt as well. And in a way, it speaks to Jonathan's point as well. I think what state power wants from the good citizen, if you like, is a bit of religion, but not too much. It does certainly want to, and in France, of course, you have an extreme version of that in its so-called revolutionary politics and its universalism. And I think certainly we need to think about the difference between organized Jewish relations to the state and organized Muslims' relation to the state. And I think we also need to think, and here I think it's not just about racialization, but it's very much about the agency of Muslims, both collectively and individually, is that refusal to be emptied out, that refusal to be to accept a kind of westernized version of religion, as I said, kind of something that you do in the home and nowhere else, and which is a kind of very much a one-dimensional version of religion. Rightly from their point of view. So I think ultimately it is about relations to power and resisting that power. And of course, to label those that resist state power, the version of the good Muslim that empties out content, the version of the good Jew the same. Resisting that doesn't mean you're a terrorist, of course, and that's the kind of link at the moment that people are making.
I want to sort of wrap up this this line of thought and then move on to maybe a final discussion, which Rebecca Vince has asked, has written two questions here that I think are very well, comments / questions that I think are very interesting that I'd like us to get to. But first, I want to offer a kind of anecdote from my own ethnographic research, and as a way to kind of tie all of this together. So some time ago, this was quite early on, and I was at a LGBT Jewish association's event in Paris. And we were sitting down. It was there was going to be a talk and a discussion. It was a pretty small, intimate group of people, very small room, kind of like in someone's basement. And before we started, we went around introducing ourselves, saying our names, who we are, and what interested us to come down to listen to this talk. The talk, as it happened, was on homosexuality and Orthodox Judaism, and was given by two yeshiva students who hoped to come back to. They were studying in New York, and they hoped to come back to Paris to set up their own Orthodox synagogue that was inclusive of LGBT Jews. So we went around introducing ourselves, and this one individual stated his name, and let's call him, let's use one of my names, let's call him Saleem. So he said, hi, I'm Saleem. The next thing he said kind of struck me. He said, je ne suis pas juif, I'm not a Jew. And he explained that he was Muslim. And the reason why he was there was because this question of religion and homosexuality was very important to him, and he didn't know of many Muslim spaces where he could approach this topic. As someone who also studies queer Muslim spaces, that's not entirely true, and I introduced him to a few people later on. But what was striking about that was actually my reaction, and I kind of immediately was in the mindset that, hey, this is an example of good Muslim relations. And later on, when I read Yulia's work, I thought about it, and I thought about how would Saleem actually see this? Is this sort of, am I being that American tourist who's kind of like, oh my God, this would never happen in the United States? Or from Saleem's perspective, is this just sort of, well, it just kind of makes sense. I want to learn about homosexuality and religion. Islam and Judaism, maybe not so different as religions. So it's a practical matter that I'm here. But then how to make sense of him, this is what I came to later, how to make sense of him saying, I am not a Jew, very declaratively. What did that mean? And so later on, I met up with him and I asked him, this is one thing that's been puzzling me. Why did you start by saying that I'm not a Jew? And earlier on, I was kind of thinking maybe he's emphasizing that he's Muslim as a way to provide a bridge, or, I was really thinking in this sort of good Muslim relations, Jewish Muslim relations model. But he told me actually something that was completely not what I had expected at that particular moment. He said, well, I wanted them to know that I was Muslim because I've been in similar spaces before. And if I'm assumed to be a Jew, I might hear things that offend me. I might hear people saying Islamophobic things. So I just wanted it to be clear that that I'm here. I'm a Muslim in this space, and I, as a way to avoid any kind of discomfort that might arise. So that kind of turned everything on the head for me. And I think that entire episode kind of encapsulates a few things. One, what is at risk? I mean, what is at stake here in terms of Jewish and Muslim identities and assumptions? But two, and this might be even more important, what it means for a researcher to sort of immediately see things as Jewish-Muslim relations, and how dangerous that inclination might actually be, and what is that actually responding to. So I think we'll kind of tie that up here, unless Yulia and Bryan or Jonathan want to add on anything to that. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Can I just say one thing? But for me, that's a really fascinating. And actually, I think I heard that from you before you met up with him. That's a really interesting anecdote. But I would argue that I still would not give up on thinking about this relational idea, right? Because in fact, it seems to me that that's not such, I mean, that doesn't shock me, like what this person was saying. It brings to mind actually a number of different things. One is that he was basically kind of outing himself, right, in that space as not being Jewish. And I think that, that's a really like an important, I'm kind of purposefully using that term because I think that there is something about kind of confession and our ideas about honesty that are kind of coming in here. But the other piece of it is that, what he's carrying here is an awareness of complexity, right? And of tension, and of also that, clearly there's some notion of tension, but there's also a notion that is not so tense that people are going to kick me out, right? And I'm not sure what the reaction was, but I could very much picture people saying, well, welcome, right? So I would say that you could just take that and you could go very, very far, keeping the kind of category of Jewish-Muslim relations in mind, but in a really expanded way that is not unitary by any means, nor exclusive of other sorts of relations, right? So anyway, I find that to be fascinating. And for me, that's like, there's a lot that you could do with that.
That's a really interesting comment. That yes, he absolutely was welcomed, and in fact, if there was any tension, it was a kind of uneasiness about a white Frenchman who was blonde, very tall, who was in the room, and that tension dissipated when he said he was Jewish. But if there was any tension, it was there. Anyway, well, that's also something to think about, because maybe I'll reference Ethan Katz's work and Maud Mandel's work, where they, I think the term might be, actually I can't remember whose term it is, someone might correct me, but one of them uses the term triangular in thinking about Jewish-Muslim relations. And so one way that I understood that tension was a recognition of the historical role played by the French state in organizing relations between Jews and Muslims, particularly in colonial North Africa. But then again, that might not have been it at all. There's a real danger about making too many assumptions. I'll read out Rebecca's comments and questions, and that'll bring us back to two things. One, what we were talking about earlier, about these accusations by the French government towards left-wing academics and activists, some of whom are racialized as Muslims, and two, the idea of good Jew, bad Jew. So the first comment by Rebecca, I'll read it out. Contemporary historical analogy in relation to the French case, the Islamogauchist tag, which conflates the words Islam and leftists, is now widely used by members of the government, large sections of the media, and hostile academics. It is reminiscent of the anti-Semitic Judeo-Bolshevism accusation in the 1930s, which blamed the spread of communism on Jews. And she provides us with a link here. I think you'll be able to see it once I mark it as answered. And her second comment is, I'd also like to unpack this idea of good Jew, bad Jew more, as it appears that goodness and badness are often related to positionality, specifically vis-a-vis the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. For example, and she cites you now, Bryan Cheyette states, quote, Jews are good if they are actively pro-Palestinian, end quote. While Alana Lentin states, quote, bad Jews are anti-Zionist, end quote. And she provides us links here as well.
Well, just really interesting. The phrase Judeo-Bolshevik is very much at the heart of right-wing nationalist Polish politics currently. And they, someone who was a great influence on me, Zygmunt Bauman, was ostracized, vilified, and turned into a pariah because he was right-wing nationalists labeled him a Judeo-Bolshevik, and it's not just the 1930s, that term is very prevalent to this day, and is very much part of a kind of Eastern European nationalist politics. But I do like the link with the French version in relation to Muslims. I thought that's an interesting link. So that I like a lot. So just that, first of all, as a comment. I've forgotten the second question. What were the second part? What did Rebecca talk about?
Well,
just wait, I can check myself.
Okay.
Just wait. Oh, no open questions. It's gone.
Answered in the very last one, and she's talking about, she wants to unpack the idea of good and bad in relation to Jews.
And the specific quote is, I'd also like to unpack this idea of good Jew, bad Jew. It appears that goodness and badness are often related to positionality, specifically vis-a-vis the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Yes. I think this book that Adi mentioned sounds fascinating. The refusal of various Muslim writers to condemn And I think one could read that in relation to, we haven't talked a lot about Israel-Palestine, but the way that there's a kind of politics around how pro-Palestinian you are, how anti-Zionist you are, as Rebecca said. So I'd like to bring that together with the how condemning the question of condemning various terrorists or various other activities. So I'd like to very much see that book by Adi and then think through that book in relation to Israel-Palestine. I think that sounds quite interesting.
I've just posted the link. It's edited by Asim Qureshi. The link's in the chat. I think it comes out this month.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I don't know the book, but that is fascinating in the sense that, right, the kind of call to condemn, right, is very much, if you answer that call, you are brought into a very, very particular kind of formatted discourse, or however, whatever apparatus, whatever you want to call it. And that does strike me as like, I think people resist that in all sorts of different ways, both in terms of questions of terrorism and in terms of questions of Israel, right? And so I can see how kind of really rich ethnographic work, right, whether it's thick or it's thin, right, is a really valuable way of kind of seeing how that might be resisted without ever necessarily being verbalized.
Yeah. Well, the work that Yulia draws a lot on Amir Mufti's work in her book and adds to it in really interesting ways. And Amir is now writing a book on Palestine. I think Edward Said in Jerusalem, I think it's called. And he said, and I didn't like this at all, I pushed back at this, but he said, all these liberal Jewish folk that like my book in relation to South Asia, I hope they'll respond in the same way to my book on Palestine. And again, it's that kind of politics. So it means that the category of diaspora, the category of minority, the category of being outside of these places of conflict, the fact that we are outside of these places of conflict, and many of us choose not to take part in that conflict, is something that, as you said, Jonathan, quite rightly, that's somehow not allowed, that we have to become part of the conflict. So it's a very difficult question. I'm not pretending I've got the right answer on this, and of course there is a danger here of quietism. But I think if you're going to be an activist, to use Adorno's term, you have to be a thinking activist, rather than just someone who is going to put your thumb up or thumb down on issues.
I think we're sort of nearing the end here, but Yulia, do you want to add anything to that?
I was just going to say in response to Rebecca's question that this is indeed a great question in the sense that it demonstrates that this theoretical avenue that one can pursue in unpacking terms pretty much every step of the way is indeed quite important. Also returning to what Bryan has just said about being a thinking activist. Also to pick up on something that Bryan has just said, the relationship between activism and theoretical thinking, I think, also intersects in very interesting ways in these debates. Kind of just as it does in debates, one would think of the theoretical debates about essentialism versus constructivism, as oftentimes anthropologists find that they feel really uncomfortable with what they see as the research participants essentializing their identities or other identities. I think that what Rebecca's question points to is that, yes, this intersection of theory with activism is unavoidable, and one really has to think every step of the way and
Absolutely.
think about
Well,
every single term.
yeah, well, this is active life politics. We've shown that, so that we have to engage with for sure.
Absolutely, and I think if we're talking about the intersection of academic work and activist work, what Bryan has been talking about in terms of supersessionist thinking, if I've understood him correctly, is somewhat of a model for us to follow, both in our scholarly and our activist work. I think Brian Klug is listening to us, and a few days ago or a few weeks ago, he sent me 2 different statements that were made by Jewish groups regarding recent terrorist attacks. And there's something striking about the difference between them. So one of them was right after the murder of Samuel Paty in France, and the subsequent heavy-handed government response and quite undemocratic response by the French government. This statement was by the Jewish Union, the French Jewish Union for Peace, and it very clearly adopted what Bryan would call supersessionist, supersessionist thinking rather, actually, and linked Jewish and Muslim experience together, and called the French state out for using terrorism as a way to justify state Islamophobia. And they were very clear, and I thought that was an exemplary statement that drew on historical analysis and the conceptual analysis of the position of Jews and Muslims in European imaginary in the past and present, in order to call out the French state's targeting of the Muslim minority right now. On the other hand, a group of European rabbis, this was after what happened in Vienna, called for increased surveillance of mosques. So we have 2 very different responses that I think show us in a way how to do, if we want to retain Jewish-Muslim relations, how to do it well and how to do it very, very badly.
Yeah. And we're back to Jonathan's plural. So we have to remember it's the S on the end of relations, absolutely.
All right, well, with that, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much to Yulia, Bryan, and Jonathan for participating, and actually, you know, thanks to everyone, because it's a very anxious moment at the moment. So I guess I'll leave you all to go and continue biting your nails and worrying yourself endlessly.
Thank you, Adi, and everybody, and Bryan and Yulia.
Thank you.